An alibi on Baker Street twists into deception. Welcome to Shadow Code. I am your host, Thornwick. Comment your location. Your words make these mysteries unforgettable. A man's lies don't always spill from his mouth. Sometimes they squeak from his shoes or twitch at the corners of his eyes. The one standing in Wolfe's office that morning had all three, and it was only the beginning. The October rain had been falling steadily since dawn, turning the streets of Manhattan into mirror-black ribbons that reflected the amber glow of street lamps, even in daylight. From the window of Nero Wolfe's office on West 34th Street, I watched the water cascade down the glass in lazy rivulets, distorting the world beyond into impressionist smears of grey and gold. The sound of it drumming against the brownstone's old bones had been my only companion for the better part of an hour, save for the occasional rustle of newspaper from behind Wolfe's desk and the distant clatter of Fritz preparing lunch in the kitchen below. It was the kind of morning that made you grateful for solid walls and a steady job, even when that job occasionally involved explaining to wealthy eccentrics why their missing poodles weren't worth a retainer that could feed a family of 4 for a month. I'd been nursing my second cup of Fritz's coffee and contemplating the merits of finding more stimulating employment when the doorbell rang at exactly 10:43. I glanced at Wolfe, who hadn't looked up from his copy of the Times. The newspaper formed a perfect barrier between his considerable bulk and the rest of the world, and I knew from experience that he wouldn't acknowledge the interruption until he'd finished parsing every syllable of whatever article had captured his attention. The man's capacity for selective deafness was truly a marvel to behold. The bell rang again, more insistently this time. Archie. His voice carried the particular note of resigned irritation that meant he'd been forced to acknowledge reality, despite his better judgment. On it. I set down my cup and headed for the front door, pausing just long enough to straighten my tie. You never knew when a simple Tuesday morning might deliver something worth dressing up for. The man on our doorstep looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts of different people, and none of them had fit quite right. He was tall without being imposing, thin without appearing delicate, with prematurely grey hair that had been combed with mathematical precision, despite the rain trying its best to undo the work. His overcoat was expensive but worn, his shoes polished to a military shine, and his eyes held that particular combination of desperation and calculation that usually meant either blackmail or murder, sometimes both. "Mr. Goodwin." His voice carried a faint accent, something European that had been worn smooth by years of American living. "I telephoned earlier about the consultation." I hadn't taken any calls that morning, but Fritz sometimes screened them when Wolfe was indisposed. "You'd be Mr. Kellerman, Dr. Marcus Kellerman." He extended a gloved hand. His grip was firm but brief, the handshake of a man accustomed to professional courtesy without genuine warmth. "I believe your employer might be interested in my situation." "Come in out of the rain, Doctor." I stepped aside to let him pass, noting the way he paused in the hallway to study the arrangement of coats on the rack, as if memorizing details he might need later. "Mr. Wolfe is in his office." Kellerman followed me down the hall, his footsteps creating a rhythm slightly off from my own, not quite matching, not quite contrasting. It was subtle, but after years of paying attention to such details, I'd learned that the way a person walks can tell you as much about their intentions as the words they choose to speak. Wolfe had finally set aside his newspaper and was regarding our visitor with the expression he usually reserved for inferior cuts of meat or poorly prepared vegetables. His massive frame filled the chair behind his desk like a Buddha carved from expensive stone, and his small dark eyes took in every detail of Kellerman's appearance with the methodical precision of a jeweler examining a suspicious diamond. "Dr. Kellerman." Wolfe's tone suggested he'd already formed several unflattering opinions, and was merely being polite enough to let the man speak before dismissing him. Archie informs me you have a consultation in mind. Yes. Kellerman remained, standing despite my gesture toward the red leather chair that faced Wolfe's desk. His hands stayed clasped behind his back, and I noticed the way his weight shifted from foot to foot. Not nervousness exactly, but the restrained energy of a man fighting the urge to pace. I find myself in need of professional assistance. Indeed. Wolfe's fingers drummed once against the arm of his chair, a sure sign of growing impatience. Perhaps you might elaborate on the nature of this assistance. I believe I'm going to be accused of murder. That got Wolfe's attention. His drumming fingers went still, and he leaned back slightly in his chair. An interesting concern. Might I inquire as to the basis for this belief? Kellerman finally moved to the chair I'd indicated, settling into it with the careful movements of a man who'd recently discovered his world was less stable than he'd assumed. 3 days ago, a colleague of mine was found dead in his apartment. The police have ruled it suicide, but... He paused, his fingers worrying at the buttons of his overcoat. There are aspects of the case that may lead them to reconsider. And you believe this reconsideration will focus on you? I know it will. Kellerman's voice carried absolute certainty. Because I lied to them about where I was when he died. I leaned against the window frame, watching our visitor's reflection in the rain-streaked glass. His image wavered and shifted with each droplet's path, making him appear somehow less substantial than the man actually sitting in the chair. It struck me as an appropriate metaphor. A curious admission, Wolfe observed. Most individuals who seek my services prefer to maintain their innocence rather than confess to perjury. I didn't kill him. The words came quickly, with the rehearsed quality of a phrase that had been repeated many times. But I can't prove where I was, and the alibi I gave them, it won't hold up to serious scrutiny. Then perhaps you might consider telling the truth. Kellerman's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Mr. Wolfe, if I could tell the truth without destroying 3 lives and probably ending my career, I wouldn't be sitting in your office right now. Wolfe's eyebrows rose by perhaps a millimeter, which for him constituted a dramatic display of surprise. 3 lives? My own, my wife's, and that of someone who trusted me to keep a confidence. Kellerman's hands had moved to his lap, where his fingers continued their nervous dance against the fabric of his trousers. The truth would answer the question of where I was, but it would raise a dozen others that I'm not prepared to address. I see. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond Kellerman's shoulder. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from polite skepticism to something approaching interest. And what, precisely, would you have me do about this predicament? Find another explanation for Philip's death, one that doesn't require my presence or absence to be relevant. Kellerman leaned forward slightly. You're supposed to be the best at finding the truth, Mr. Wolfe. I need you to find one that doesn't destroy everyone involved. The truth, Wolfe said carefully, is rarely convenient, and it cannot be altered to suit our preferences regardless of the consequences. I'm not asking you to manufacture evidence or ignore facts. I'm asking you to look beyond the obvious explanation. Kellerman's voice took on an edge of desperation that he'd been trying to suppress. Philip Hartwell was a brilliant man, but he had enemies, professional rivals, disgruntled patients, creditors. The police haven't even begun to investigate the possibilities. Because they have no reason to suspect murder rather than suicide? Because they're lazy. The words came out sharper than Kellerman had probably intended. He took a breath, visibly composing himself. Philip left a note. It was found on his desk, typed on his personal stationery, signed in his own hand, but anyone who knew him would understand that Philip would never have killed himself. Not like that. How did he die? I asked, speaking for the first time since the introductions. Kellerman turned to look at me, and I got my first clear view of his eyes. They were pale blue, almost colorless, with the kind of intensity that suggested either deep intelligence or complete madness. In my experience, the two weren't mutually exclusive. Pills, he said. Barbiturates. He supposedly took them with a glass of scotch and simply went to sleep. And you believe this inconsistent with his character? Philip was terrified of losing control. He wouldn't drink more than 1 glass of wine with dinner, and he refused to take anything stronger than aspirin for pain relief. The idea that he would deliberately overdose on sleeping pills. Kellerman shook his head. It's impossible. Yet, the police found evidence of both substances in his system. According to the preliminary report, yes, Kellerman's fingers had returned to worrying at his coat buttons. But the toxicology results won't be complete for another week. There's still time to establish that this wasn't suicide. Time, Wolfe observed, but perhaps not opportunity. If the death occurred 3 days ago, any physical evidence at the scene will have been compromised or removed. Witnesses will have had time to refine their recollections, and those with something to hide will have perfected their deceptions. Which is why I need someone who can see past the obvious answers. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since he'd arrived, some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. Mr. Wolfe, I've heard that you can deduce a man's entire life story from the way he ties his shoes. Surely you can find the truth behind Philip's death before the police decide to start asking uncomfortable questions about my whereabouts. Wolfe was silent for nearly a full minute, his massive head tilted slightly, as if listening to some distant music. The rain continued its percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the quarter hour. Finally he spoke. Your fee will be $500 per day, plus expenses. Payment in advance for 1 week. Kellerman nodded quickly, reaching for his wallet. Of course. How soon can you begin? Archie will provide you with the necessary forms and arrange for your retainer. Wolfe's attention had already begun to drift back toward his abandoned newspaper. In the meantime, I suggest you prepare a complete and accurate account of your relationship with the deceased, as well as a detailed timeline of your activities during the relevant period. The truth of your whereabouts may indeed prove inconvenient, Dr. Kellerman, but lies have a tendency to become significantly more so. After Kellerman had left, retainer paid, forms completed, and promise extracted to return the following morning with the requested information, I found myself alone with Wolfe and the steady sound of October rain. He'd returned to his newspaper, but I could tell by the way he held it that his attention was elsewhere. Interesting case, I said, settling back into my chair with a fresh cup of coffee. Perhaps. Wolfe turned a page without reading it. Tell me, Archie, what did you observe about our visitor that might bear on the credibility of his account? I'd been expecting the question. His shoes were expensive and well-maintained, but the left sole showed wear patterns consistent with favoring that foot, probably an old injury. His handshake was professional but brief, suggesting either natural reserve or deliberate caution. The way he studied our coat rack when he came in indicated someone accustomed to memorizing details, which fits with medical training, and he lied at least twice during the conversation. Wolfe finally lowered his newspaper. Indeed. Which lies did you detect? He claimed he telephoned earlier about a consultation, but his body language when he said it suggested improvisation rather than recollection. He also said Philip Hartwell left a suicide note signed in his own hand, but when he mentioned it, his eyes moved up and to the left. Classic indicator of accessing constructed rather than remembered images. Satisfactory observations. What else? I considered the question, replaying the conversation in my mind. He's genuinely afraid, but not just of being accused of murder. There's something else he's worried about. something that might be revealed if his real alibi comes to light. And despite his claims about wanting to find the truth, I got the impression he'd be perfectly happy if Philip Hartwell's death remained classified as suicide, as long as he's not implicated. An astute analysis. Wolfe set aside his paper entirely. Dr. Kellerman presents us with an interesting paradox. A client who wishes to hire us to investigate a crime he hopes will remain unsolved. Think he killed Hartwell? The probability exists. However, his willingness to engage our services suggests either innocence or remarkable confidence in his ability to mislead us. Wolfe's fingers resumed their drumming. In either case, the investigation promises to be educational. That afternoon, while Wolfe retreated to the plant rooms for his daily communion with the orchids, I took a walk downtown to visit Inspector Kramer at police headquarters. The rain had stopped, but the city still wore its grey October shroud, and the streets smelled of wet concrete and car exhaust, mixed with the occasional hint of something cooking from the restaurants and food carts that lined the sidewalks. Kramer was in his office, surrounded by the usual chaos of case files, coffee cups, and the persistent cloud of cigar smoke that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He looked up when I knocked on his open door, and his expression suggested he was trying to decide whether my appearance constituted a good omen or a harbinger of bureaucratic disaster. Goodwin. He gestured toward a chair without much enthusiasm. What brings you to my little corner of municipal paradise? Information. I settled into the chair and noted that it had been strategically positioned to offer visitors an unimpeded view of the precinct's holding cells, probably to encourage cooperation. About a recent death, Philip Hartwell. The doctor who killed himself? What's Wolfe's interest in a suicide? Client confidentiality prevents me from being specific, but let's say we've been asked to look into some aspects of the case. Kramer's expression shifted to weary resignation. Of course you have. And I suppose you want me to share the details of an ongoing investigation with a private investigator who has no official standing and a history of making my job more complicated than it needs to be. That would be helpful, yes. Tough luck. But even as he said it, Kramer was reaching for a file folder on his desk. Hartwell was found dead in his apartment Sunday morning by his housekeeper. Preliminary examination suggests barbiturate overdose, probably self-administered. Suicide note was found on his desk, typed and signed. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. What did the note say? The usual. Apologies to family and friends, references to financial difficulties and professional disappointments, expression of hope that people would understand. Kramer opened the folder and glanced at a page inside. Nothing particularly revealing, but they rarely are. Financial difficulties. His practice wasn't doing well. Psychiatrists aren't exactly recession-proof, and apparently he'd been having trouble keeping patients. There were also some questions about his professional conduct, nothing that had reached the level of formal complaints, but rumors that might have hurt his reputation. What kind of rumors? The kind that psychiatrists probably hear about each other all the time. Inappropriate relationships with patients, questionable therapeutic methods, that sort of thing. Kramer closed the folder. Look, Goodwin, I know Wolfe likes to find murder where everyone else sees suicide, but sometimes people really do kill themselves. Hartwell was a middle-aged man with a failing practice, mounting debts, and a reputation that was starting to suffer. He had means, opportunity, and motive. Any family. Ex-wife in California, no children. They'd been divorced for about 5 years, and according to her, they hadn't spoken in over 2 years. She seemed genuinely surprised when we called to notify. Her friends, colleagues, we're still working on that. So far we've identified about 12 people who had regular contact with him, mostly other doctors and a few patients who were willing to talk to us. Nothing suspicious has turned up. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more question. You mentioned that his housekeeper found him. What time was that? Around 9 in the morning. She had a key and came in 3 times a week to clean. Hartwell was supposed to be out of town for the weekend. Had told her not to come in until Monday, but she'd forgotten something and stopped by to retrieve it. Where was he supposed to be? Some medical conference in Philadelphia, but when we checked with the hotel, he never showed up. Kramer's eyes narrowed slightly. Which is another point in favor of suicide, if you ask me. Man cancels his weekend, plans, stays home alone, and takes a fatal overdose. Pretty straightforward. Except for the part where he was terrified of losing control and never took anything stronger than aspirin. Kramer's eyebrows rose. Where'd you hear that? Just something that came up in conversation. I headed for the door. Thanks for the information, Inspector. Goodwin. His voice stopped me in the hallway. If Wolfe finds anything that suggests this wasn't suicide, you'll share it with us, right? Scout's honor. You were never a Boy Scout. Details. The walk back to the brownstone gave me time to think about what Kramer had told me, and by the time I arrived, I'd formed some preliminary theories about Dr. Philip Hartwell and his untimely death. None of them were particularly encouraging. For our client's prospects, Wolfe was back in his office, having concluded his afternoon consultation with the orchids. He looked up expectantly when I entered, and I gave him a complete rundown of my conversation with Kramer, including the details about Hartwell's supposed weekend plans and the housekeeper's discovery of the body. Interesting, Wolfe said when I'd finished. Dr. Kellerman failed to mention that the deceased was expected to be out of town when he died. Maybe he didn't know about the conference, or perhaps he knew Dr. Hartwell wasn't planning to attend. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. The question becomes whether this knowledge is relevant to his death or merely to our client's deception about his own whereabouts. You think Kellerman was with Hartwell that weekend? I think Dr. Kellerman's relationship with the deceased is significantly more complex than he indicated during our initial consultation. Wolfe's fingers began their familiar drumming pattern. The question is whether that complexity extends to murder. The next morning brought Dr. Kellerman back to our office, as promised, with a manila folder containing what he claimed was a complete account of his relationship with Philip Hartwell and a detailed timeline of his activities during the relevant weekend. He looked like he'd slept badly, if at all, and the careful precision of his appearance had been replaced by the slightly rumpled look of a man who'd forgotten to pay attention to such details. I've included everything you requested, he said, placing the folder on Wolfe's desk, though I'm not sure how helpful it will be. Wolfe opened the folder and began reading, his expression giving nothing away. After several minutes, he looked up. You were colleagues at St. Mary's Hospital. For 3 years, yes. We both left around the same time, Philip to start his private practice, and I to take a position at Columbia Presbyterian. Yet you maintained a personal friendship? We did. Kellerman's voice carried a note of defensiveness. Philip was a complicated man, but he was also brilliant. His insights into human psychology were remarkable, even if his bedside manner left something to be desired. According to your timeline, you last saw Dr. Hartwell on Friday evening, October 15th, at approximately 7 o'clock. That's correct. Where did this meeting take place? His apartment. We had dinner together and discussed some professional matters. What sort of professional matters? Kellerman hesitated, his fingers returning to their familiar dance with his coat buttons. Philip had been consulting on a case of mine, a patient with some unusual psychological symptoms that fell outside my area of expertise. The name of this patient? I'm afraid that's confidential. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted. Dr. Kellerman, You have engaged my services to investigate what you believe to be a murder. Such investigations necessarily involve the examination of confidential information. If you are unwilling to provide complete cooperation, perhaps you should reconsider your need for my assistance. It's not that simple. Kellerman looked genuinely distressed. The patient in question is well known. Any public revelation of their psychiatric treatment would be professionally and personally devastating. I am not in the habit of making public revelations, Dr. Kellerman. However, I cannot conduct an effective investigation based on partial information. Kellerman was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. Finally he looked up. Margaret Aldrich, the wife of Senator Aldrich. I felt my eyebrows rise. Senator James Aldrich was a prominent Republican from Connecticut, frequently mentioned as a potential presidential candidate. His wife's involvement with a psychiatrist would indeed be the kind of information that could destroy careers and reputations with equal efficiency. Mrs. Aldrich has been receiving treatment for what condition? Wolfe asked. Depression and anxiety, primarily related to her husband's political career and its demands on their marriage. Kellerman's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. But there have been some concerning developments recently. Episodes of memory loss, paranoid thoughts, occasional violent outbursts. Philip was helping me determine whether these symptoms represented a progression of her existing condition or something more serious. And you discussed this case during your dinner on Friday evening? Yes. Philip had some theories about her. Condition that I found as disturbing. In what way disturbing? Kellerman stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to us. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the words were difficult to say. He believed someone was poisoning her. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady tick of the clock on Wolfe's desk and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Finally, Wolfe spoke. A serious accusation. What evidence supported this theory? The pattern of her symptoms, their timing, the fact that they seemed to worsen after certain social events or family gatherings. Kellerman turned back to face us. Philip had decades of experience with psychiatric conditions, Mr. Wolfe. When he said Mrs. Aldrich's symptoms weren't consistent with natural progression of mental illness, I believed him. Did he identify a suspect? He had theories, but before he could present any evidence, he was dead. And where were you, Dr. Kellerman, during the time when Dr. Hartwell was dying? The question hung in the air like smoke from one of Kramer's cigars. Kellerman returned to his chair, but instead of sitting, he gripped the back of it with both hands. Saturday evening, from approximately 8 o'clock until midnight, I was in Senator Aldrich's study, going through his wife's personal papers. I blinked. You were burglarizing a senator's house? I was trying to find evidence to support Philip's theory. Kellerman's voice carried a mixture of desperation and defiance. Mrs. Aldrich had given me permission to examine her medical records and personal correspondence, but her husband had forbidden it. Philip thought the answer might be in her appointment calendars, her social correspondence, anything that might show a pattern to her symptoms. And did you find such evidence? No. But that's not the point. The point is that I can't tell the police where I was without admitting to breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and probably half a dozen other crimes. And even if I were willing to accept those consequences, the revelation would destroy Mrs. Aldrich's reputation and probably end her husband's political career. Wolfe was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the folder containing Kellerman's statement. When he finally spoke, his tone was thoughtful rather than accusatory. Dr. Kellerman, you present me with an interesting problem. You wish me to investigate a death that you believe was murder. but you cannot provide your own whereabouts during the relevant time without admitting to serious crimes. You claim the deceased suspected someone of poisoning a prominent political figure, but you cannot produce evidence of this theory without violating multiple confidentialities. And you insist that you are innocent of Dr. Hartwell's death, despite having both motive and opportunity to silence him before he could present his accusations. I know how it looks. Kellerman's voice was barely audible. But I didn't kill Philip, and if someone murdered him to prevent his investigation into Mrs. Aldrich's condition, then she's still in danger. Perhaps. Wolfe closed the folder. Archie, I believe we require additional information before proceeding further. Please arrange for us to interview Mrs. Aldrich. Mr. Wolfe, I don't think that's... Kellerman began. Dr. Kellerman, you have presented me with a case that involves potential murder, criminal conspiracy, and threats to a prominent political figure. Either these claims are accurate, in which case Mrs. Aldrich's cooperation is essential to the investigation, or they are fabrications designed to conceal your actual involvement in Dr. Hartwell's death. In either case, speaking with her directly seems advisable. She won't see you. The senator has her under virtual house arrest since Philip's death. He's convinced that any publicity about her psychiatric treatment will ruin his presidential ambition. Then perhaps you might arrange for her to come here. How? That, Dr. Kellerman, is your problem to solve. After Kellerman left, clutching the business card I'd given him with instructions to call when he'd secured Mrs. Aldrich's cooperation, Wolfe and I spent the remainder of the morning reviewing what we knew about the case and what we still needed to learn. Thoughts? Wolfe asked, leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man contemplating a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. Several. First, Kellerman is lying about something, but I'm not sure it's murder. His story about breaking into the senator's house is either the truth or an incredibly elaborate fabrication. Second, if Hartwell really believed someone was poisoning Mrs. Aldrich, that gives us a potential motive for murder that doesn't involve our client. Third, the timing of Hartwell's death, just after he'd formed this theory, is either remarkably coincidental or highly suspicious. And your assessment of Dr. Kellerman's credibility? Mixed. He's genuinely frightened, but not just of being accused of murder. There's something else he's hiding, something that might be revealed if his movements that weekend become public knowledge. His concern for Mrs. Aldrich seems genuine, but it could also be a convenient cover for his real motives. Satisfactory. Wolfe reached for his copy of the morning paper. In the meantime, I suggest you pay a visit to Dr. Hartwell's apartment. The police may have finished their initial examination, but they were looking for evidence of suicide rather than murder. A fresh perspective might prove illuminating. Philip Hartwell had lived in a converted brownstone on East 73rd Street, in one of those neighborhoods where the buildings were old enough to have character and expensive enough to keep out anyone who couldn't afford to appreciate it. The apartment building's lobby was small but elegant, with marble floors and brass fixtures that had been maintained with the kind of attention that suggested residents who valued appearances and had the means to maintain them. The superintendent, a thin, nervous man named Rodriguez, was initially reluctant to let me examine Hartwell's apartment, but a combination of official-looking credentials and a $20 bill convinced him that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. The police had removed the tape from the door that morning, he explained, and the landlord was eager to get the place cleaned and rented again. Terrible thing, Rodriguez said, as he unlocked the door to apartment 4B. Dr. Hartwell seemed like such a quiet man. Never any trouble, always paid his rent on time, very polite to the other tenants. Hard to believe he'd do something like that. Did you know him well? Not really. He kept to himself mostly. But he was always nice when we'd meet in the hallway or the lobby. Asked about my family, remembered my son's name, that sort of thing. Some of the tenants, They look right through you like you're part of the furniture. But the doctor, he always treated me like a person. The apartment was larger than I'd expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that filled the rooms with pale October light. The furniture was expensive but understated, the kind of pieces that suggested good taste and adequate income without ostentation. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, from the precisely arranged books on the shelves to the carefully folded newspapers on the coffee table. "The police finished here yesterday," Rodriguez said, hovering in the doorway. "They didn't find anything unusual, far as I could tell. Just took some papers from his desk and a few personal items." I walked through the living room, noting details that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. The books were primarily professional texts and medical journals, with a few works of classical literature and several volumes on art history. The coffee table held copies of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and something called the American Journal of Psychiatry from the previous month. The kitchen was spotless, with no dirty dishes in the sink, and nothing in the refrigerator that suggested recent meal preparation. Either Hartwell had eaten out for his final meals, or he'd cleaned up with unusual thoroughness before taking his own life. The bedroom was where he'd been found. Rodriguez pointed to a spot beside the bed where chalk outlines still marked the position of the body. The bed itself had been stripped, but I could see the faint stains on the mattress where bodily fluids had soaked through the sheets. A small bedside table held a glass that had presumably contained the scotch and barbiturates, and a prescription bottle sat beside it with the cap removed. "The police said he just took the pills and went to sleep," Rodriguez said. "Seems like a peaceful way to go if you had to pick one. Did you see Dr. Hartwell that weekend, Saturday or Sunday?" "No, and I was here both days. Had some maintenance work to catch up on, so I was in and out of the building pretty regularly. If he'd come or gone, I probably would have noticed." I examined the prescription bottle. The label indicated it had been filled 3 weeks earlier, by a pharmacy on Lexington Avenue, prescribed by a Dr. William Morrison for insomnia. According to the label, the bottle had originally contained 30 pills, and only 5 remained. "Rodriguez, did Dr. Hartwell have trouble sleeping?" "Not that I know of. His apartment's right above mine, and I never heard him moving around at night or anything like that. But I suppose if he was having problems, he'd know how to get help for it." The desk in Hartwell's study showed signs of recent police attention. Papers had been moved and drawers left slightly open. But there were still items that might have been overlooked: appointment calendars, address books, correspondence that might shed light on his relationships and recent activities. His appointment calendar for October showed a fairly typical schedule for a psychiatrist in private practice: patient appointments during regular business hours, with evenings and weekends mostly free. But there were several entries that caught my attention. On October 10th, 5 days before his death, there was a notation that simply read "Ma urgent." 3 days later, on October 13th, another entry: "K consultation, serious concerns." I flipped back through the previous months, looking for patterns. The initials M.A. appeared regularly, usually once or twice a week, always during evening hours when the office would normally be closed. The K consultation entries were less frequent but had become more common in recent weeks. "Rodriguez, did Dr. Hartwell often have visitors in the evenings?" "Sometimes, not a lot, but occasionally someone would come by after regular hours. I always figured it was patients who couldn't make it during the day, you know, people with jobs. That made it hard to get away during normal appointment times. Did you ever see these evening visitors? Could you describe any of them?" Rodriguez considered the question. "There was one woman who came by fairly regularly. Well-dressed, always, wore a hat and sunglasses, even when it wasn't particularly sunny. She'd call from the lobby and he'd buzz her up. Never went through the usual visitor protocol. I got the impression she was someone who valued her privacy." How about men? Any male visitors in recent weeks? There was another doctor who came, by a few times. Tall guy, grey hair, always carried a medical bag. He and Dr. Hartwell seemed to know each other pretty well. I'd see them talking in the lobby sometimes, very serious conversations. That would be Kellerman, I realized. The timing fit with his claims about consulting on Mrs. Aldrich's case. I spent another hour going through the apartment, looking for anything that might contradict the suicide theory or support Kellerman's claims about a murder investigation. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, I found several bottles of prescription medications, all properly labeled and apparently used according to directions. None of them were barbiturates, and most were for minor conditions, allergies, occasional headaches, digestive problems. Hardly the collection you'd expect from someone who regularly used sleeping pills. The most interesting discovery came in a small filing cabinet in the study. Among the folders containing patient records and financial documents, I found one labeled, simply Special Cases. It contained only a few sheets of paper, but they were filled with handwritten notes in what I assumed was Hartwell's careful script. The notes were fragmentary and cryptic, more like reminders to himself than formal case documentation. But several phrases stood out. Pattern consistent with chronic low-level exposure. Symptoms worsen following family gatherings. Consider environmental factors versus psychological triggers. And most intriguingly, J.A. access to meals, medications, personal items. J.A. James Aldrich, the senator. I was photographing these notes with the small camera I always carried when Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. Just getting a sense of how Dr. Hartwell lived. I slipped the camera back into my pocket. "Tell me, did he seem different in recent weeks? More anxious, preoccupied, anything like that?" Rodriguez thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, he did seem a bit on edge lately. I'd see him checking his mail more often than usual, and a couple of times when I said hello to him in the lobby, it was like he didn't hear me at first, like his mind was somewhere else. Any idea what might have been bothering him?" "Well, there was that business with his car." I looked up from the filing cabinet. "What business?" "Someone broke into it about 2 weeks ago. Happened right here on the street in broad daylight. Strangest thing, though, they didn't take anything. Not his radio, not the spare change in the console, nothing. Just went through his papers and left everything scattered around." "Did he report it to the police?" "He said he was going to, but I don't think he ever did. When I asked him about it a few days later, he just said it probably wasn't worth the trouble." Rodriguez shook his head. "If it was my car, I'd have been raising hell with the cops." "Did Dr. Hartwell say anything about what papers were in the car?" "Just patient files and appointment schedules, far as I know, but whoever broke in seemed real interested in them. Went through everything real careful-like, according to the doc." I finished my examination of the apartment with a growing sense that Philip Hartwell's death was significantly more complicated than either the police or our client had indicated. The evidence of a break-in, the cryptic notes about environmental factors and access to medications, and the pattern of secret evening appointments all suggested a man who had discovered something dangerous and was trying to decide what to do about it. The question was whether he'd been killed to prevent him from acting on that discovery, or whether the stress of the situation had driven him to take his own life. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe had finished his afternoon session in the plant rooms and was settled behind his desk with a glass of beer and what appeared to be a complex crossword puzzle. He looked up expectantly when I entered, and I gave him a complete account of my visit to Hartwell's apartment, including the details about the car break-in and the notes I'd found in the filing cabinet. "Interesting," he said when I'd finished. "The pattern becomes clearer." "Which pattern is that?" Dr. Hartwell suspected someone in Senator Aldrich's household of gradually poisoning his wife. He began documenting his observations and developing evidence to support his theory. Someone became aware of his investigation and attempted to retrieve his notes by breaking into his car. When that failed to produce the desired result, more direct action became necessary. You think someone killed him to prevent him from exposing the poisoning? I think the probability exists. Wolfe set aside his crossword. The question is whether our client is aware of this possibility or is himself involved in the conspiracy. Kellerman? Consider the facts, Archie. Dr. Kellerman claims to have been consulting with Dr. Hartwell about Mrs. Aldrich's condition. He admits to being in the senator's house on the night of the murder, ostensibly searching for evidence to support Hartwell's poisoning theory. He presents himself as concerned for Mrs. Aldrich's welfare, yet he waited 3 days after Hartwell's death to engage our services. Either he is remarkably naive about the implications of the situation, or he is playing a more complex game than he has revealed. Before I could respond, the phone rang. Fritz answered it in the kitchen, and a moment later he appeared in the pined doorway. "A Mrs. Aldrich is calling for Mr. Goodwin," he announced. "She says Dr. Kellerman gave her this number." I glanced at Wolfe, who nodded slightly. "I'll take it in here, Fritz." The voice that came through the telephone was soft and cultured, with the kind of precise diction that suggested expensive education and careful breeding. But underneath the polished exterior, I could hear traces of something that might have been fear. "Mr. Goodwin, Dr. Kellerman said you might be able to help me. We're certainly willing to try, Mrs. Aldrich. Mr. Wolfe and I would like to speak with you about Dr. Hartwell and his recent concerns regarding your health." There was a long pause before she responded. "I'm afraid that's not possible. My husband has restricted my activities since Philip's death. He's concerned about publicity. We understand the delicate nature of the situation, Mrs. Aldrich. Perhaps we could meet somewhere discreet, away from your home and the senator's schedule?" "No, you don't understand." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm not allowed to leave the house without an escort. James has hired private security, supposedly for my protection, but they watch my every movement. I can't even make telephone calls without supervision." I covered the mouthpiece and relayed this information to Wolfe, who frowned thoughtfully, before gesturing for me to continue. "Mrs. Aldrich, are you in immediate physical danger?" I don't know. Philip thought so. He wanted me to leave James, to go somewhere safe until he could prove what was happening to me. But I couldn't believe. James is my husband. Why would he want to hurt me? Dr. Hartwell believed someone was poisoning you. Yes, he said my symptoms weren't consistent with natural mental illness, that someone was giving me something that was affecting my mind and my memory. But the idea that James could be... it's unthinkable. "Mrs. Aldrich, is there any way you could come to our office without arousing suspicion, perhaps under the pretext of a medical appointment or some other legitimate errand?" Another long pause. "There might be a way. I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow afternoon, my regular physician, not a psychiatrist. James usually has one of the security men drive me, but the appointment is at 3 o'clock, and there's a political fundraiser that evening that he needs to prepare for. If I could somehow slip away from the driver..." "What's your doctor's address?" She gave me the information, and we arranged for her to meet us at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the medical building at 4 o'clock. The plan was simple but risky. She would tell her driver she needed to stop at a pharmacy to fill a prescription, then slip out the back entrance while he waited in the car. "Mrs. Aldrich," I said before hanging up, "one more question. Have you noticed any patterns to your symptoms? Do they seem to occur after particular meals, social events, or times when you've been in contact with specific people?" Philip asked me the same thing. And yes, now that I think about it, the episodes do seem to happen more often after family dinners or social gatherings at the house. Philip thought that was significant. After she hung up, Wolfe and I spent several minutes discussing the implications. of what we'd learned. If Mrs. Aldrich's account was accurate, she was essentially being held prisoner by her husband, watched by private security guards who might or might not be aware of their true purpose. The situation was either an elaborate scheme to protect a mentally unstable woman from public scrutiny, or a carefully orchestrated attempt to prevent her from revealing information that could destroy a political career. The senator's behavior suggests guilt, I observed. If he were genuinely concerned about his wife's mental health, he'd be encouraging her to seek treatment, not isolating her from potential sources of help. Perhaps. Or he may simply be prioritizing his political ambitions over his wife's well-being. Wolfe reached for his beer glass. In either case, our interview with Mrs. Aldrich tomorrow should prove illuminating. Assuming she can get away from her watchers. Indeed. And assuming Dr. Kellerman's account of the situation is accurate rather than an elaborate deception, designed to conceal his own involvement in Dr. Hartwell's death. That evening, as I sat in my room reviewing the notes I'd taken during the day, I found myself thinking about the various ways the case could unfold. If Kellerman was telling the truth, then we were dealing with a conspiracy that involved the gradual poisoning of a senator's wife and the murder of a psychiatrist who had discovered the crime. If he was lying, then we might be helping a murderer construct an alibi while distracting attention from his own guilt. The problem was that both scenarios were equally plausible, given the available evidence. Kellerman's behavior was consistent, with either a man trying to protect innocent people from a dangerous conspiracy, or a killer attempting to manipulate the investigation to serve his own purposes. What bothered me most was the timing. If someone had been poisoning Mrs. Aldrich for months, why had Hartwell chosen this particular moment to voice his suspicions? And why had Kellerman waited 3 days after the psychiatrist's death to engage our services? The answers to those questions might determine whether we were working for justice or being played for fools. The next afternoon, Wolfe and I arrived at the small Italian restaurant on East 68th Street, 15 minutes early. The place was perfect for a discreet meeting, dimly lit with small tables tucked into private corners, and a staff that seemed to value customer privacy above curiosity. We selected a table near the back, with a clear view of both entrances and enough distance from other patrons to ensure our conversation wouldn't be overheard. Mrs. Margaret Aldrich arrived precisely on time. But she wasn't alone. The woman who approached our table was elegantly dressed in a navy wool coat and matching hat, with the kind of understated jewelry and perfect posture that suggested old money and careful breeding. But it was the man walking 2 steps behind her that caught my attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the alert eyes and obvious bulge of a shoulder holster that marked him as professional security. Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin? Her voice was the same cultured tone I'd heard on the telephone, but there was a tension in her bearing that hadn't been apparent during our phone conversation. I'm Margaret Aldrich. This is Mr. Patterson, who insisted on accompanying me. Patterson nodded politely but didn't offer to shake hands. His eyes were constantly moving, cataloguing exits and potential threats with the methodical precision of a man trained to expect trouble. Mrs. Aldrich, Wolfe rose slightly from his chair. Please, join us. She took the seat across from Wolfe, while Patterson positioned himself at a small table nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to maintain the pretense of not listening to our conversation. I apologize for the escort, Mrs. Aldrich said quietly. James insists on these precautions since Philip's death. He's concerned that publicity about my condition might attract unwanted attention. Your husband's concern is understandable, Wolfe replied diplomatically. However, it does complicate our ability to discuss sensitive matters. Patterson is discreet. He won't repeat anything he hears here. I wasn't sure whether that was reassurance or warning, but Wolfe seemed inclined to proceed. Mrs. Aldrich, Dr. Kellerman has told us that Dr. Hartwell suspected someone of deliberately causing your symptoms. Can you tell us about your condition and when it first began? She glanced toward Patterson, who was apparently absorbed in studying the restaurant's wine list, then leaned slightly forward. It started about 8 months ago. At first, just occasional forgetfulness, moments of confusion, difficulty concentrating. My regular doctor thought it might be stress related to James's political schedule, but the symptoms worsened. Yes, memory lapses became more frequent, and I began experiencing periods of paranoia and anxiety. Sometimes I would find myself in rooms with no memory of how I'd gotten there, or I'd discover that hours had passed without my awareness. James became concerned that I was having some sort of breakdown. Were these episodes random, or did they follow any particular pattern? Philip asked me the same question. At first I thought they were random, but when I began keeping a diary at his suggestion, I noticed they seemed to occur most often after family gatherings or social events at our home. She paused, her fingers working nervously at the clasp of her purse. Philip thought that was significant. Did Dr. Hartwell share his suspicions with you directly? Not initially. For the first few months of treatment, he focused on traditional therapeutic approaches. But recently he began asking questions about my daily routine, my meals, the medications I take, even my beauty products and household items. Her voice dropped even lower. Last week, he told me he believed someone was deliberately causing my symptoms. How did you respond to this accusation? I didn't believe him at first. The idea that someone, that James, could be poisoning me seemed impossible. But Philip was very convincing. He said my symptoms were consistent with chronic, low-level exposure to certain substances that could affect cognitive function and memory. Did he identify these substances? He mentioned several possibilities, certain types of sedatives, some industrial chemicals, even some metals that can accumulate in the body over time. He said more sophisticated testing would be needed to determine exactly what was being used. And did you agree to such testing? Mrs. Aldrich glanced again toward Patterson, who had now turned his attention to the breadbasket on his table. Philip wanted me to go to a private laboratory, somewhere James wouldn't know about it. But before we could arrange it, he was dead. Mrs. Aldrich, I said, leaning forward slightly, do you believe your husband is capable of harming you? The question hung in the air for several seconds. When she finally answered, her voice was barely audible. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. James can be demanding and controlling, especially when it comes to political matters, but he's never been physically violent. But lately, she trailed off, her eyes fixed on her hands. Lately, he's different, more distant, more secretive. He spends long periods locked in his study, making phone calls that he ends abruptly when I enter the room. And there have been changes in our household routine, new staff members that he hired without consulting me, modifications to our security arrangements that seem excessive for the threats we normally face. When did these changes begin? Around the time my symptoms started becoming more severe. James said they were necessary because of his increasing prominence in the party, but the timing... She shook her head. Philip thought the timing was significant. Mrs. Aldrich, are you prepared to undergo the medical testing that Dr. Hartwell recommended? I want to know the truth. If someone is doing this to me, I need to know who and why. She looked up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her voice carried a note of determination rather than fear. But I need protection. If James is responsible, or if someone else in our household is involved, I can't continue to live there while the investigation proceeds. That can be arranged, Wolfe said. However, such arrangements require careful planning and absolute discretion. The wrong approach could result in significant danger to all parties involved. What do you need from me? Complete cooperation and complete honesty. If we are to prove that you are being poisoned, we will need access to your medical records, samples of your food and medications, and detailed information about everyone who has regular contact with you. Additionally, we will need to examine your home environment and daily routine. That's impossible. James would never allow strangers to investigate our household. Then we must find another approach. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his massive head tilted as if listening to some internal calculation. Mrs. Aldrich, would you be willing to wear a small recording device during your interactions with family members and household staff? You want me to spy on my husband? I want to determine whether he is attempting to murder you. The bluntness of his statement seemed to shock her. She sat back in her chair, her face pale, and for a moment I thought she might faint. But then something shifted in her expression, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady. What kind of recording device? Something small and undetectable, designed to capture conversations and ambient sounds. The technology exists to provide high-quality recordings that would be legally admissible if necessary. And if the recordings prove that James is involved, then we will have the evidence necessary to ensure your safety and bring him to justice. She was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving between Wolfe and me as if trying to gauge our trustworthiness. Finally she nodded. All right, but I want guarantees about my safety. If this goes wrong, if James discovers what I'm doing. Mrs. Aldrich, Wolfe's tone was reassuring but firm. If your husband is indeed attempting to poison you, then your safety is already compromised. Our investigation represents your best chance of survival. We spent another 20 minutes working out the details of the recording operation and arranging for the sophisticated medical testing that would determine whether Mrs. Aldrich was indeed being poisoned. She would return to her normal routine while wearing the hidden device, but she would also maintain daily contact with us through a secure telephone line that we would establish. As we prepared to leave, I noticed Patterson checking his watch and whispering something into a small microphone attached to his jacket collar. Either he was reporting to the senator about the duration of our meeting, or he was coordinating with other security personnel about Mrs. Aldrich's schedule. In either case, it was clear that her movements were being monitored more closely than she might have realized. Mrs. Aldrich, I said as we walked toward the restaurant's exit, one final question. Have you spoken to anyone else about Dr. Hartwell's suspicions? Only Dr. Kellerman. Philip had been consulting with him about my case, and after Philip died, Marcus called to express his condolences. When I mentioned Philip's theories about poisoning, Marcus seemed very concerned. He was the one who suggested I contact you. Did Dr. Kellerman offer any theories about who might be responsible? He said Philip had suspected someone with regular access to our household, someone who could tamper with my food or medications without arousing suspicion, but he didn't name anyone specifically. After Mrs. Aldrich and her escort left, Wolfe and I lingered over coffee while discussing our next moves. The case was becoming more complex by the hour, with multiple suspects and motives that ranged from political ambition to financial gain to personal revenge. Thoughts? Wolfe asked. Several. First, Mrs. Aldrich seems genuinely frightened and genuinely confused about her symptoms. If she's acting, she's remarkably good at it. Second, her account of the senator's recent behavior changes supports the theory that he's involved in her poisoning, but it could also indicate that he's concerned about her mental stability and trying to protect both of them from scandal. And third, the level of security surrounding her suggests either genuine concern for her safety or a sophisticated attempt to control her movements and limit her access to potential allies. Patterson didn't strike me as a typical bodyguard. He was too attentive to our conversation and too quick to report our activities to his superiors. Your assessment of her credibility? High. Her emotional responses seemed authentic, and the details she provided were consistent with Kellerman's account and Hartwell's notes. But there's still the possibility that she's being manipulated by someone who wants us to believe she's being poisoned. Indeed. Wolfe signaled the waiter for the check. The recording device will provide additional information, but we cannot wait for that evidence to begin our investigation. Too much time has already passed since Dr. Hartwell's death. What's our next move? I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation with Dr. Kellerman. His account of events has been consistent but incomplete. There are aspects of his relationship with both Dr. Hartwell and Mrs. Aldrich that require clarification. You think he's hiding something? I think everyone involved in this case is hiding something, Archie. The question is whether their secrets are relevant to murder or merely embarrassing to reveal. That evening, Dr. Kellerman returned to our office at Wolfe's request. He looked even more haggard than he had during our previous meetings, with the hollow-eyed appearance of a man who hadn't been sleeping well. His clothes were wrinkled, and his normally precise grooming had been replaced by the distracted look of someone whose mind was focused on more pressing concerns than personal appearance. You spoke with Margaret? He asked before he'd even taken a seat. We did. Wolfe gestured toward the red leather chair. Her account was illuminating, though it raised as many questions as it answered. What kind of questions? Questions about your relationship with both Mrs. Aldrich and Dr. Hartwell. Questions about the timing of your various actions and decisions. Questions about your true motives for engaging our services. Kellerman settled into the chair but remained tense, his hands gripping the armrests as if preparing to flee at any moment. I've told you everything relevant to the case. Have you indeed? Wolfe's tone was deceptively mild. Then perhaps you can explain why you failed to mention that Dr. Hartwell had been treating Mrs. Aldrich for 8 months, rather than the few weeks implied by your previous statements. I didn't think the duration was important. Or perhaps you can explain why you waited 3 days after Dr. Hartwell's death to engage our services, despite your alleged concern for Mrs. Aldrich's safety. I needed time to think through the implications. Or perhaps you can explain why you chose to search Senator Aldrich's house on the specific evening when Dr. Hartwell was dying, rather than on some other occasion when your presence would be less difficult to explain. Kellerman was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond Wolfe's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation that suggested he'd been expecting these questions for some time. You're right. I haven't told you everything. I suspected as much. Perhaps you'd care to provide the complete story now. The complete story? Kellerman laughed, but there was no humor in it. The complete story would destroy several lives and accomplish nothing except satisfying your curiosity. Dr. Kellerman, a man is dead. If that death was murder, then his killer must be identified and brought to justice. If it was suicide, then Mrs. Aldrich may still be in danger from whoever drove him to take his own life. In either case, the complete story is exactly what we need to hear. Kellerman stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him clearly. I've been having an affair with Margaret Aldrich for 6 months. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and impossible to ignore. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I could see the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was reassessing everything we'd learned about the case. Continue, Wolfe said simply. It began innocently enough. Philip had asked me to consult on her case because her symptoms weren't responding to traditional treatment. I started meeting with her regularly to discuss her condition and potential therapeutic approaches. But Margaret she's an extraordinary woman, intelligent, cultured, genuinely kind, and she was trapped in a marriage with a man who saw her as nothing more than a political asset. And you saw her as something more? I saw her as someone who deserved better than she was getting. Kellerman turned back to face us, and I could see the conflict in his expression. The senator treats her like an expensive possession, something to be displayed when convenient and locked away when not needed. Philip was concerned that her depression and anxiety were being exacerbated by her domestic situation, and the more I got to know her, the more I agreed with his assessment. So you decided to rescue her. I decided to offer her an alternative. Margaret is wealthy in her own right. Her family has significant holdings that are independent of her husband's political career. If she were willing to leave James, she could live comfortably without him. But she was reluctant to abandon her marriage. She was terrified of the scandal. James has convinced her that his political success is essential to the country's future, and that any public revelation of their marital problems would be tantamount to treason. It's sophisticated psychological manipulation, but it's manipulation nonetheless. Dr. Kellerman, I said, where does Dr. Hartwell's poisoning theory fit into this domestic drama? That's what makes this so complicated. Kellerman returned to his chair but remained perched on the edge as if ready to bolt. About 6 weeks ago, Margaret's symptoms began worsening significantly. She was having episodes of severe confusion and memory loss, sometimes lasting for hours. Philip became convinced that something environmental was causing the deterioration. And you agreed with his assessment? Initially, yes, but then I began to wonder if Philip's suspicions were being influenced by his own feelings about the situation. His own feelings? Philip disapproved of my relationship with Margaret. He thought I was taking advantage of a vulnerable patient, and he was concerned that my personal involvement was clouding my professional judgment. When he started talking about poisoning, I wondered if he was looking for a dramatic explanation that would justify his opposition to the affair. But you supported his investigation. I supported the idea of finding out what was causing Margaret's symptoms, but I was also concerned that Philip's theories might be based more on wishful thinking than medical evidence. Wishful thinking. If Margaret was being poisoned by her husband, then my affair with her would be recast as a heroic rescue rather than an unethical relationship with a patient. Philip may have convinced himself that the poisoning theory was true because it made my behavior seem more acceptable. Wolfe was quiet for several minutes, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. Finally, he spoke. Dr. Kellerman, you present an interesting psychological analysis of Dr. Hartwell's motives. However, you have not explained why you chose to search the senator's house on the evening of the murder. Because I wanted to find evidence that would either prove or disprove Philip's theory. If Margaret was being poisoned, then we needed to identify the source before her condition worsened further. If she wasn't being poisoned, then we needed to find alternative explanations for her symptoms. And what did you find? Nothing conclusive. Margaret's personal papers included appointment calendars and social correspondence, but nothing that showed a clear pattern connecting her symptoms to specific events or individuals. There were some household bills and staff schedules that might have been relevant, but I didn't have time to examine them thoroughly. Because Dr. Hartwell died that evening. Because I received a phone call from Philip at approximately 11 o'clock. He sounded agitated and said he needed to see me immediately, but when I tried to call him back after leaving the senator's house, there was no answer. You went to his apartment? Not that night. I assumed he'd gone to bed and would call me, say in the morning. It wasn't until Monday morning that I learned he was dead. Dr. Kellerman, do you believe Dr. Hartwell committed suicide? The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Wolfe and me as if trying to gauge what answer we expected to hear. I don't know, he said finally. Philip was under a great deal of stress. His practice was struggling. He was concerned about Margaret's condition, and he was frustrated by what he saw as my unprofessional behavior. It's possible that the combination of factors became overwhelming. But you don't believe that explanation. I believe someone killed him to prevent him from exposing information that would be damaging to powerful people. The question is whether that information concerned Margaret's poisoning or something else entirely. Something else? Philip knew about my affair with Margaret. If that information became public, it would destroy my career, end the senator's presidential ambitions, and probably result in a very expensive divorce settlement. There are people who would benefit significantly from keeping that secret. Including yourself. Including me. Kellerman's voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Mr. Wolfe, I won't pretend that I don't have motives for wanting Philip to remain silent, but I didn't kill him. And if someone else did, then Margaret may still be in danger. From whom? From whoever has been causing her symptoms, whether through poisoning or some other method, and possibly from her husband, if he's discovered our relationship and is looking for ways to eliminate the threat to his political career. After Kellerman left, Wolfe and I spent the remainder of the evening reviewing the case and trying to separate facts from speculation. The revelation of the affair between Kellerman and Mrs. Aldrich added new dimensions to both the motive for murder and the credibility of the poisoning theory. Observations? Wolfe asked. Kellerman's revelation explains some of the inconsistencies in his previous statements, but it also provides him with a compelling motive for murder. If Hartwell had threatened to expose the affair, Kellerman would have had strong reasons to silence him permanently. Agreed, however, it does not necessarily invalidate the poisoning theory. Mrs. Aldrich's symptoms are real, regardless of their cause, and they began months before her relationship with Dr. Kellerman became intimate. True, but it does raise questions about Kellerman's objectivity. If he's in love with Mrs. Aldrich, he might be more inclined to believe theories that cast her husband as a villain, rather than explanations that suggest natural illness or psychological stress. An astute observation. What is your assessment of his credibility regarding the events of Saturday evening? Mixed. His account of searching the senator's house is detailed enough to be plausible, but the timing is remarkably convenient. If he killed Hartwell, claiming to be burglarizing the senator's home would provide an alibi that he couldn't verify without admitting to serious crimes. And his claim about receiving a phone call from Dr. Hartwell? Interesting, if true. It would suggest that Hartwell was alive and agitated at 11 o'clock Saturday evening, which narrows the time of death significantly. But it's also the kind of detail that would be easy to fabricate if you were trying to establish your innocence. Indeed. Wolfe reached for his beer glass, which Fritz had thoughtfully refilled during our conversation. The case becomes more complex with each revelation, but the essential questions remain unchanged. Who killed Philip Hartwell and why? And whether Mrs. Aldrich is still in danger. Precisely. The recording device will provide additional information, but we cannot wait for that evidence to draw preliminary conclusions. Too many lives may depend on our ability to identify the truth quickly and accurately. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I was reviewing the photographs I'd taken at Hartwell's apartment when Fritz announced that Inspector Kramer was at the door, accompanied by 2 detectives and what appeared to be a warrant. Trouble? I asked Wolfe. Almost certainly. He said, aside his newspaper with a sigh. Please show them in, Fritz. Kramer entered the office with the purposeful stride of a man who was either about to make an arrest or demand explanations that might lead to one. The 2 detectives flanked him like bookends, their expressions suggesting they were prepared for resistance. Wolfe, Goodwin. Kramer's greeting was perfunctory. We need to talk. Indeed? Wolfe's tone was politely neutral. About what matter? About your involvement in the Philip Hartwell case and about the information you've been withholding from the official investigation. I was unaware that we were withholding information. Were you aware that your client, Dr. Marcus Kellerman, was having an affair with Senator Aldrich's wife? Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained composed. That is certainly an interesting development. How did you come by this information? Anonymous tip. Phone call yesterday evening, about an hour after Kellerman left your office. Kramer's eyes narrowed. The caller seemed remarkably well informed about the details of the relationship and its connection to Hartwell's death. And you found this anonymous information credible. Credible enough to obtain warrants to search Kellerman's home and office. Credible enough to discover evidence of the affair that Kellerman failed to mention during our initial interviews. Credible enough to consider the possibility that Hartwell was blackmailing him and ended up dead for his trouble. I glanced at Wolfe, who was regarding Kramer with the expression he usually reserved for particularly challenging crossword puzzles. Inspector, have you arrested Dr. Kellerman? Not yet. He's currently answering questions at headquarters, and his answers will determine whether charges are filed. But I thought you should know that your client is now the prime suspect in a murder investigation, based on evidence of an extramarital affair, based on evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. Kellerman had access to Hartwell's apartment, knowledge of his habits and schedule, and compelling reasons to want him dead. The affair provides the motive, his medical training provides the means, and his false alibi provides the opportunity. His alibi? Claims he was burglarizing Senator Aldrich's house Saturday night. Convenient story, but impossible to verify without admitting to serious crimes. Classic false alibi construction, just plausible enough to create doubt, just inconvenient. Enough to explain why he can't prove it. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against his desk. Inspector, have you considered the possibility that the anonymous caller was attempting to divert suspicion from the actual perpetrator? Of course, but the evidence supports the caller's claims. Kellerman lied to us about his relationship with Mrs. Aldrich, lied about his reasons for being interested in Hartwell's death, and lied about his whereabouts during the relevant time period. At some point, credibility becomes a significant issue. Indeed it does. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Inspector, I wonder if you might be willing to share the exact wording of the anonymous tip. Kramer consulted a notebook he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. Caller identified himself as a concerned citizen who had information about the Hartwell suicide. Said he'd observed Dr. Kellerman and Mrs. Aldrich together on several occasions, always in circumstances that suggested a romantic relationship. Claimed that Hartwell had discovered the affair and was planning to expose it. Did the caller provide specific dates, times, or locations for these observations? Some. Enough to give us starting points for verification, and when we checked those details, they turned out to be accurate. Hotel registrations under false names, restaurant reservations, even photographs from a private investigator who'd been following Mrs. Aldrich. Photographs. Seems the senator hired someone to document his wife's activities, professional job, long-range telephoto lenses, careful surveillance techniques, detailed logs of her movements and contacts. He's been building a case for divorce proceedings. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. If Senator Aldrich had known about his wife's affair for weeks or months, it changed the entire dynamic of the case. The poisoning theory might be accurate, but the motive could be marital rather than political. Inspector, Wolfe said carefully, when did Senator Aldrich engage these surveillance services? According to the invoices we found about 3 months ago, right around the time Mrs. Aldrich's symptoms began worsening significantly. And the senator was aware of the affair before Dr. Hartwell's death? The surveillance reports were delivered to his office every Friday. The most recent report, dated October 14th, included detailed documentation of his wife's relationship with Kellerman, including photographs of them together at various locations around the city. Wolfe and I exchanged glances. October 14th was the day before Hartwell's death, and it was also the day Kellerman claimed to have had his final dinner with the psychiatrist. Inspector, has Senator Aldrich been questioned about his knowledge of the affair and its possible connection to Dr. Hartwell's death? We've scheduled an interview for this afternoon, but so far his cooperation has been limited. Claims executive privilege regarding his wife's medical treatment and invokes spousal privilege regarding their private communications. Understandable given his political position? Maybe, but it's also convenient if he's got something to hide. Kramer closed his notebook and returned it to his pocket. Look, Wolfe, I know you think there's more to this case than a simple love triangle gone wrong, but sometimes the obvious answer is the right answer. Kellerman was sleeping with another man's wife. Hartwell threatened to expose the affair, and Kellerman killed him to keep his secret safe. Perhaps. However, there remain certain inconsistencies that deserve investigation, such as the method of murder, for one. Dr. Kellerman is a physician with access to numerous substances that would be more reliable and less detectable than barbiturates mixed with alcohol. If he intended to kill Dr. Hartwell, why choose a method that required precise timing and dosage calculations when simpler alternatives were available? Maybe he wanted it to look like suicide. Then why not use a method more consistent with Dr. Hartwell's character and habits? According to multiple witnesses, the deceased was extremely cautious about medications and rarely consumed more than minimal amounts of alcohol. Kramer considered this for a moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Dr. Kellerman did indeed kill Dr. Hartwell, he chose a remarkably inappropriate method for someone with his medical knowledge and access to pharmaceutical resources. And if he didn't kill Hartwell, then we are dealing with a murderer who either wanted the death to appear suspicious or who lacked the medical expertise to choose a more convincing suicide method. After Kramer and his detectives left, Wolfe and I spent the morning analyzing the new information and its implications for our investigation. The revelation that Senator Aldrich had been having his wife surveilled added a completely new dimension to the case, but it also raised troubling questions about our own safety and that of our client. If the senator has known about the affair for months, I said, then his recent behavior toward his wife takes on a more sinister cast. The increased security, the restrictions on her movements, the isolation from potential allies, it could all be preparation for something more permanent than divorce proceedings. Agreed. And if he was indeed poisoning her gradually, the discovery of the affair would provide additional motivation to accelerate the timeline. But it still doesn't explain Hartwell's death. If the senator wanted to eliminate threats to his marriage and political career, why kill the psychiatrist instead of Kellerman or his wife? Perhaps because Dr. Hartwell represented the greatest immediate danger. A respected physician making accusations of deliberate poisoning would carry significantly more weight than the claims of an unfaithful wife or her lover. True, but if Senator Aldrich is the killer, how did he know about Hartwell's suspicions? Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his massive head tilted in thought. An excellent question. Either Dr. Hartwell shared his theories with someone who reported them to the senator, or the senator has sources of information within the psychiatric community that we have not yet identified. Or Kellerman told him. That is certainly a possibility. If Dr. Kellerman was indeed working with Senator Aldrich to eliminate threats to both their interests, the affair could be a convenient cover story rather than a genuine romantic relationship. The thought was disturbing but not implausible. If Kellerman and the senator were collaborating, then our investigation could be walking directly into a carefully constructed trap. Mrs. Aldrich might be the victim of a conspiracy involving both, her husband and her supposed lover, with Hartwell's death serving as a warning to anyone else who might discover their scheme. Before I could voice these concerns, the telephone rang. Fritz answered it in the kitchen, and moments later appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained alarm. "Mrs. Aldrich is on the telephone," he announced. "She sounds very distressed and says it's urgent." I took the call at Wolfe's desk, noting that his extensions allowed him to listen in on the conversation. Mrs. Aldrich's voice was shaking with what sounded like genuine panic. "Mr. Goodwin, thank God you're there. Something terrible has happened." "What's wrong, Mrs. Aldrich?" "They've arrested Dr. Kellerman for Philip's murder, but that's not the worst part." Her voice broke, and I could hear her struggling to maintain control. "James knows about our relationship. He confronted me this morning with photographs, recordings, detailed reports about every meeting Marcus and I have had. Are you safe? I don't know. James has dismissed most of our regular staff and replaced them with people I don't recognize. Patterson is still here, but there are others now. Men who watch me constantly and report my activities directly to James." "Mrs. Aldrich, can you leave the house?" "No. James has made it clear that I'm not to go anywhere without his explicit permission. He's told everyone that I'm having a breakdown and might be dangerous to myself or others." "What about the recording device we discussed?" "I haven't had a chance to use it yet. With all the new security arrangements, I'm afraid they might discover it." I covered the mouthpiece and quickly briefed Wolfe on the conversation. He nodded grimly and gestured for me to continue. "Mrs. Aldrich, do you still believe someone has been poisoning you?" "More than ever. My symptoms have been getting worse since yesterday, and this morning I found evidence that someone has been tampering with my medications." "What kind of evidence?" "The capsules in my prescription bottles look different. Slightly different colors, different textures. And there are new medications in my bathroom cabinet that I didn't know about. Things James must have added to my daily routine without telling me." "Have you taken any of these medications today?" "I've been afraid to take anything, but James is starting to notice that I'm not following my usual schedule, and Patterson asked why I hadn't taken my morning pills. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. If Mrs. Aldrich was correct about the medication tampering, she might be in immediate physical danger. But if she was suffering from paranoid delusions brought on by the stress of the investigation, her refusal to take legitimate medications could also be dangerous. "Mrs. Aldrich, is there any way you can get samples of these medications to us for testing?" "I don't think so. Patterson accompanies me everywhere now, even to the bathroom, and James has installed new security cameras throughout the house." "What about the recordings? If you could document your husband's behavior or conversations with the security staff, it might provide the evidence we need to intervene." "I'll try. But Mr. Goodwin, I'm scared. James has been making phone calls about arrangements for a private medical facility, somewhere I could receive intensive treatment for my condition. I think he's planning to have me committed. We won't let that happen, but you need to be extremely careful about what you say and do. If your husband suspects that you're aware of his plans, he might accelerate the timeline. What should I do?" "Play along with his expectations. Take your medications as prescribed, but try to retain samples if possible. Act confused and compliant, but pay attention to conversations and activities around you. And call us immediately if the situation changes in any way." After Mrs. Aldrich hung up, Wolfe and I spent several minutes discussing our options. The case had reached a critical juncture, where any action we took could either save her life or precipitate the very crisis we were trying to prevent. "If Senator Aldrich is indeed planning to have his wife committed," I said, "we need to act quickly. Once she's in a private psychiatric facility under his control, gathering evidence about poisoning or murder becomes nearly impossible. Agreed. However, direct intervention carries significant risks. If we are wrong about the senator's intentions, our actions could be construed as kidnapping or interference with legitimate medical treatment. And if we're right about his intentions, our inaction could result in Mrs. Aldrich's permanent confinement or death. Indeed. Wolfe reached for the telephone. I believe it is time to involve additional resources in this investigation, such as Dr. Sarah Mitchell is a forensic psychiatrist of excellent reputation and unimpeachable credentials. If we can arrange for her to examine Mrs. Aldrich independently, her professional opinion would carry significant weight in any legal proceedings. Will she agree to see Mrs. Aldrich under these circumstances? Dr. Mitchell has worked with us before on cases involving questions of mental competency and psychiatric manipulation. She understands the delicate nature of such situations and the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation. While Wolfe made arrangements with Dr. Mitchell, I called Inspector Kramer to update him on the recent developments. His reaction was predictably skeptical, but I could tell that some of our concerns were beginning to resonate with his investigative instincts. You're asking me to believe that a United States Senator is systematically poisoning his wife while framing another man for murder, he said. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the case is more complicated than it initially appeared. Goodwin, we've got solid evidence against Kellerman. Motive, means, opportunity, and a pattern of deception that goes back months. What you're describing sounds like a conspiracy theory cooked up by a desperate defense attorney. Then explain the timing. If Kellerman killed Hartwell to protect his affair, why wait until the psychiatrist had already formed theories about poisoning? Why not act earlier, before Hartwell became suspicious about Mrs. Aldrich's condition? Maybe the affair wasn't the only secret Hartwell discovered. Meaning, maybe Kellerman was involved in the poisoning. Maybe he and the senator were working together to eliminate Mrs. Aldrich, and Hartwell threatened to expose both of them. The possibility had occurred to me, but hearing it stated so bluntly was still unsettling. If Kramer was right, then our efforts to protect Mrs. Aldrich might be playing directly into the conspirators' hands. Inspector, regardless of who killed Hartwell, Mrs. Aldrich may still be in immediate danger. She's reporting evidence of medication, tampering and increasing restrictions on her freedom of movement. Based on the word of a woman who's been diagnosed with paranoid episodes and memory loss? Based on the observations of someone who has been our client's primary target throughout this investigation? Whether her symptoms are caused by poisoning, mental illness, or psychological stress, she deserves protection from further harm. I'll consider it. Kramer's tone suggested he was ending the conversation. But Goodwin, if you're wrong about this, if Kellerman really is the killer and you're helping him construct an elaborate defense, there will be consequences. Understood. That afternoon, Dr. Mitchell arrived at the brownstone for a briefing on the case and the challenges involved in examining Mrs. Aldrich under the current circumstances. She was a woman in her 50s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of human deception and self-delusion. The situation you've described is certainly complex, she said after reviewing the materials we'd assembled. Distinguishing between genuine symptoms of poisoning and psychological symptoms caused by marital stress and paranoid ideation will require careful examination and sophisticated testing. Can such testing be conducted without Senator Aldrich's knowledge or consent? Wolfe asked. That depends on Mrs. Aldrich's legal capacity to make her own medical decisions. If she's been declared mentally incompetent, her husband would have the legal right to control her medical care. But if she retains legal capacity, she can authorize testing independently. And if the testing reveals evidence of poisoning, Then we would have a legal and ethical obligation to report it to the appropriate authorities. Deliberate poisoning constitutes attempted murder, regardless of the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. Dr. Mitchell, what would you need to conduct a preliminary evaluation of Mrs. Aldrich? Ideally, a private meeting in a neutral location where she can speak freely about her symptoms and experiences. I would also need samples of her medications and any other substances she consumes regularly, as well as hair and blood samples for toxicological analysis. That may be difficult to arrange given the current security restrictions. Then we may need to be creative about our approach. Is there any location where Mrs. Aldrich goes regularly that might provide an opportunity for a brief consultation? I thought about what we knew of her routine. She has regular appointments with her primary physician, but those are usually accompanied by security personnel. What about religious services, social obligations, family gatherings? According to what she told us, most of her social activities have been curtailed since her symptoms began worsening, but there might be some regular commitment that her husband considers too important to cancel. Find out, Dr. Mitchell said, and in the meantime, I'll arrange for the laboratory facilities we'll need if we can obtain the necessary samples. That evening I called Mrs. Aldrich using the secure telephone line we'd established. She sounded exhausted and frightened, but she confirmed that she was still able to speak privately during certain hours when the security staff assumed she was sleeping. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Worse. The confusion episodes are lasting longer, and I'm having trouble remembering conversations from earlier in the day. But I've been more careful about my medications, and I think I've managed to save samples of several different pills." "Can you get those samples to us?" "I don't know how. James has someone watching me at all times now, and they search my purse and coat pockets whenever I leave the house." "What about your regular activities? Is there anywhere you go routinely where we might be able to arrange a meeting?" "There's a charity luncheon tomorrow at the Plaza Hotel. James wants me to attend because several major donors will be there, and my absence would raise questions about my health. Will you be accompanied by security?" "Probably Patterson and at least one other person, but these events are usually crowded, and there are often multiple conversations happening simultaneously. If someone approached me discreetly, we'll arrange it. Can you bring the medication samples? I'll try to hide them in my jewelry or makeup case. Those are the only personal items they don't search thoroughly." "Mrs. Aldrich, one more question. Have you been able to use the recording device?" "A few times, but carefully. James has been making more phone calls lately, and some of them sound very concerning. He's definitely making arrangements with some kind of private medical facility, and yesterday I heard him talking to someone about accelerating the timeline and ensuring there are no complications. Did you record these conversations?" "Yes, but Mr. Goodwin, I'm really frightened. Some of the things I heard. I don't think James is planning to have me treated. I think he's planning to have me killed." The charity luncheon at the Plaza Hotel was exactly the kind of high society gathering that provided perfect cover for discreet conversations and subtle surveillance. The main ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed women, discussing their various philanthropic endeavors while consuming small portions of expensive food and large quantities of wine. Dr. Mitchell had positioned herself at a table near the back of the room, disguised as a society matron with an interest in mental health advocacy. I had managed to get myself hired as a temporary waiter for the event, which gave me freedom of movement throughout the ballroom and the ability to observe the various guests and their security arrangements. Mrs. Aldrich arrived 15 minutes after the event began, accompanied by Patterson and another man I didn't recognize. She looked fragile and distracted, moving through the crowd with the careful movements of someone who wasn't entirely sure of her surroundings. But when our eyes met across the room, I could see the intelligence and determination that had motivated her to risk everything for this meeting. The challenge was creating an opportunity for her to speak privately with Dr. Mitchell without arousing the suspicion of her watchers. Patterson stayed close to her side throughout the meal, while his colleague positioned himself with a clear view of the room's exits and entrances. The opportunity came during the presentation portion of the event, when the charity's director was giving a lengthy speech about their recent accomplishments and future goals. Mrs. Aldrich excused herself to visit the ladies' room, and Patterson's colleague prepared to accompany her. But Dr. Mitchell had anticipated this possibility and created a small distraction by spilling wine on another guest's dress, requiring Patterson's colleague to help with the cleanup while maintaining his surveillance responsibilities. In the confusion, Mrs. Aldrich was able to slip into the ladies' room alone, where Dr. Mitchell was waiting for her. Their consultation lasted only 5 minutes, but it was long enough for Dr. Mitchell to conduct a brief mental status examination and for Mrs. Aldrich to transfer the medication sample she'd been carrying in a small jewelry case. When they returned to the main ballroom, both women appeared to be casual acquaintances who had struck up a conversation about mutual friends. Neither Patterson nor his colleague seemed to suspect that anything unusual had occurred. I finished my shift at the luncheon and met Dr. Mitchell back at the brownstone, where she briefed Wolfe on her preliminary observations and the materials she'd obtained from Mrs. Aldrich. My initial assessment suggests that Mrs. Aldrich is lucid and rational despite the obvious stress she's experiencing, Dr. Mitchell reported. Her cognitive function appears normal, although she does show signs of anxiety and sleep deprivation. More importantly, she was able to provide detailed and coherent accounts of her symptoms and recent experiences. And the medication samples. I've sent them to the laboratory for immediate analysis. We should have preliminary results within 24 hours and complete toxicological profiles within 48 hours. What about the recording device? I asked. Mrs. Aldrich was able to provide several recordings of her husband's recent phone conversations. The quality is quite good, and some of the content is quite disturbing. Dr. Mitchell connected a small digital recorder to Wolfe's desk system, and we listened to nearly an hour of Senator Aldrich's private phone conversations. The content was, indeed, disturbing, ranging from discussions of permanent solutions to the Margaret problem to detailed arrangements with what sounded like a private psychiatric facility that specialized in difficult cases and long-term custody arrangements. Most chilling was a conversation that had apparently taken place the previous evening. The situation has become untenable. Margaret is becoming increasingly uncooperative, and there are now outside parties asking uncomfortable questions. We need to move to the final phase immediately. Are you certain this is the best approach? Once she's committed, there will be ongoing oversight and documentation requirements. Not at this facility. Dr. Brennan has assured me that Margaret will receive the intensive treatment she requires, and that her condition will likely deteriorate to the point where long-term institutional care becomes necessary. And the other complications. Kellerman is in custody and will likely be charged within the next 24 hours. The psychiatrist's death has been classified as suicide, and there's no credible evidence linking it to Margaret's condition. Once she's safely in treatment, the remaining loose ends can be addressed. What about the private investigators? Wolfe and Goodwin? They're operating on incomplete information and false assumptions. By the time they realize what's actually happening, it will be too late to intervene effectively. The recording ended, and we sat in silence for several moments. The implications were clear. Senator Aldrich was planning to have his wife committed to a private facility where she would likely be killed or rendered permanently incapacitated. He was also aware of our investigation and confident that we couldn't stop him. "Gentlemen," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, Based on what I've heard, Mrs. Aldrich is in immediate danger. If these arrangements are implemented, she may not survive more than a few days in this private facility. Can we use these recordings as evidence? I asked. They were obtained without proper legal authorization, so their admissibility in court would be questionable. But they do provide sufficient cause for immediate intervention to protect Mrs. Aldrich from harm. Wolfe was quiet for a long time, his massive head tilted as if listening to some internal debate. Finally, he reached for the telephone. "Inspector Kramer, this is Nero Wolfe. I believe we need to discuss the Hartwell case with some urgency." The meeting with Kramer took place that evening in Wolfe's office, with Dr. Mitchell present as a professional witness and consultant. I had prepared transcripts of the recorded conversations, as well as photographs of Mrs. Aldrich's medication, samples and copies of the notes I'd found in Hartwell's apartment. "This is quite a story," Kramer said after reviewing all the materials. "Senator systematically poisons his wife, murders her psychiatrist to cover up the crime, and frames his wife's lover for the killing. Very dramatic." "Do you find it implausible?" Wolfe asked. "I find it complicated, and in my experience, complicated explanations are usually wrong." Kramer set aside the transcript he'd been reading. "But I also have to admit that some of these details are hard to explain away." "Such as?" "The medication tampering, for one. If Mrs. Aldrich is suffering from paranoid delusions, she might imagine that someone was poisoning her, but she couldn't imagine specific changes to the chemical composition of her medications. And if the laboratory analysis confirms the presence of unauthorized substances, then we'd have evidence of a serious crime regardless of who's responsible for it." Kramer reached for his coffee cup. "The recordings are more problematic from a legal standpoint, but they're certainly suggestive." "Inspector," Dr. Mitchell said, "from a medical standpoint, I can confirm that Mrs. Aldrich's mental state is consistent with chronic low-level poisoning rather than natural psychiatric illness. Her cognitive function, memory, and reasoning ability are all within normal ranges, which would be unusual for someone experiencing the kind of severe mental breakdown her husband describes." "And the symptoms she has been experiencing?" "Could easily be caused by certain types of sedatives or psychoactive medications administered without her knowledge. The pattern of symptom onset and duration is particularly consistent with pharmaceutical interference rather than natural illness." Kramer was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the evidence and presumably weighing the legal and political implications of the case. Finally, he looked up. "What do you want from me?" "Protection for Mrs. Aldrich while we gather additional evidence," Wolfe said, "and a more thorough investigation of Dr. Hartwell's death, taking into account the possibility that he was killed to prevent him from exposing the poisoning conspiracy. I can arrange protective custody for Mrs. Aldrich if she's willing to cooperate with the investigation. But getting her away from the senator and his security team won't be easy, especially if he has legal authority to make medical decisions on her behalf." "The recordings suggest that he's planning to have her committed within the next few days," I said. "If we're going to act, it needs to be soon. And if we're wrong, if Mrs. Aldrich really is mentally ill and needs the treatment her husband is trying to provide, then she'll receive proper medical care instead of being murdered by people who are supposed to protect her," Dr. Mitchell said bluntly. "Inspector, I've seen cases of psychiatric abuse before. The pattern here is unmistakable." "All right." Kramer stood up and reached for his coat. "I'll arrange for protective custody and a warrant to search the senator's house. But Wolfe, if this turns out to be an elaborate scheme cooked up by Kellerman to escape a murder charge, I'll be having some very unpleasant conversations with all of you." "Understood. However, I believe you'll find that the truth is both more complex and more disturbing than Dr. Kellerman's guilt or innocence." The next morning brought the results of the laboratory analysis of Mrs. Aldrich's medications. Dr. Mitchell called early with the preliminary findings, her voice carrying a note of professional outrage that I'd rarely heard from her. The samples contained multiple unauthorized substances, she reported. Benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and something called scopolamine, which is sometimes used as a truth serum, but can cause severe cognitive impairment and memory loss in regular doses. Enough to cause the symptoms Mrs. Aldrich has been experiencing? More than enough. The combination of substances would have created exactly the kind of confused, paranoid, and disoriented behavior that Senator Aldrich has been describing to justify his wife's confinement. Any idea how long she's been receiving these substances? Based on the concentrations and the types of chemicals involved, I'd estimate several months of regular administration. Someone has been systematically drugging her with the specific intention of making her appear mentally unstable. I relayed this information to Wolfe, who received it with the grim satisfaction of a man whose theoretical predictions had been confirmed by empirical evidence. The senator's method was sophisticated and patient, he observed. Rather than attempting a single dramatic poisoning that might be detected, he chose a gradual approach that would create the appearance of natural mental deterioration, which also provided him with a plausible defense if the poisoning was discovered. He could claim that his wife's mental illness had driven her to take unauthorized medications, either deliberately or through confusion about her prescribed treatment. Precisely. A remarkably subtle and cruel approach to murder. But we still don't have proof that the senator was the one administering the substances. Kellerman had access to Mrs. Aldrich and the medical knowledge to choose appropriate drugs. So did any number of other people in their household or social circle. True, however, the recordings provide compelling evidence of the senator's intent, and the timing of Dr. Hartwell's death suggests that someone was willing to commit murder to prevent the poisoning from being exposed. Before I could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway with the announcement that Inspector Kramer was calling with urgent news. I took the call at Wolfe's desk, noting that the inspector's voice carried an edge of excitement that suggested significant developments in the case. "We've arrested Senator Aldrich," he said without preamble. "On what charges?" "Attempted murder, conspiracy, and about half a dozen other felonies related to the systematic poisoning of his wife. The search of his house turned up a private laboratory in his basement, complete with pharmaceutical supplies and detailed records of the substances he'd been administering to Margaret." "What about Mrs. Aldrich? Safe in protective custody and receiving proper medical treatment?" Dr. Mitchell's assessment was correct. Once the unauthorized substances were eliminated from her system, her mental clarity improved dramatically. "And Kellerman?" "Still in custody, but the charges are being re-evaluated in light of the new evidence. His affair with Mrs. Aldrich certainly provided motive for murder, but the senator's poisoning conspiracy provides a more compelling explanation for Hartwell's death." "You think the senator killed Hartwell?" "I think someone killed Hartwell to prevent him from exposing the poisoning scheme, and Senator Aldrich had the most to lose from such exposure. Whether he did it personally or hired someone else is still under investigation." "What about the anonymous tip that led you to suspect Kellerman? Almost certainly came from the senator or someone working for him." "Classic misdirection. Provide accurate information about a secondary crime to divert attention from the primary conspiracy." After Kramer hung up, Wolfe and I spent several minutes discussing the resolution of the case and the various deceptions that had obscured the truth. The senator's scheme had been remarkably sophisticated, using his wife's genuine medical issues as cover for a systematic poisoning campaign, while simultaneously framing her lover for the murder of the one person who might have exposed the plot. "The truly diabolical aspect," Wolfe observed, was the way he used Mrs. Aldrich's psychiatric treatment to legitimize her symptoms. Any investigation into her condition would naturally focus on mental illness rather than deliberate poisoning. And, if Hartwell hadn't been so observant, the scheme might have succeeded indefinitely. Indeed, Dr. Hartwell's professional expertise and genuine concern for his patients' welfare made him the primary threat to the conspiracy. His death was probably inevitable once he began voicing suspicions about environmental causes for her symptoms. But we still don't know who actually killed him. Perhaps not, but we have established that his death was murder rather than suicide, and we have identified the motive and the primary beneficiary of that murder. The specific identity of the killer may be less important than the larger truth about what happened and why. 2 days later, Dr. Kellerman was released from custody and cleared of all charges related to Philip Hartwell's death. The evidence of the poisoning conspiracy and the senator's motive for eliminating threats to his scheme had convinced prosecutors that Kellerman was a victim of deliberate misdirection rather than a murderer attempting to escape justice. He came to our office that afternoon to thank us for our work on the case and to provide some final details about the investigation's aftermath. "Margaret is doing much better," he reported. "The doctors say she should make a complete recovery once all the unauthorized substances are eliminated from her system. Her memory is already improving, and the paranoid episodes have stopped entirely." "And your relationship with her?" I asked. "That's complicated. The circumstances under which we met and the stress of recent events have made it difficult to determine what our feelings really are versus what we thought they were. We've agreed to take time apart while she recovers, and I sort through my own professional and personal issues." "A wise decision," Wolfe observed. "Relationships formed under extreme circumstances often prove unstable once those circumstances change." "What about Senator Aldrich?" I asked. "He's been formally charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and several other felonies. His political career is obviously over, and he's facing the possibility of life in prison. But his lawyers are already constructing a defense based on temporary insanity and claims that he was trying to protect his wife from what he believed was a genuine mental illness. Do you think that defense will succeed?" "I doubt it. The evidence of premeditation and systematic planning is too overwhelming. This wasn't a crime of passion or temporary insanity. It was a carefully orchestrated attempt to eliminate an inconvenient spouse while maintaining plausible deniability. And Dr. Hartwell's actual killer, still unknown but probably someone hired by the senator to eliminate the threat Hartwell represented. The police are investigating several leads, including connections to private security firms that specialize in discreet services." After Kellerman left, Wolfe and I spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing the case and the various lessons it had provided about the nature of deception, loyalty, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their secrets. "Observations?" Wolfe asked. "Several. First, the case demonstrates the importance of looking beyond obvious explanations, especially when those explanations seem almost too convenient. Kellerman's affair provided a perfect motive for murder, but it was also a perfect distraction from the real crime." "Agreed. What else?" "The poisoning scheme itself was remarkably sophisticated, but it also required an understanding of psychiatric medicine that suggests either extensive research or professional consultation. Senator Aldrich may have had accomplices we haven't identified." "A reasonable hypothesis. The combination of substances used and the precise timing of their administration suggests knowledge that goes beyond what a layperson could acquire through casual research. And finally, the case illustrates how institutional authority, medical, legal, political, can be used to conceal criminal activity. Mrs. Aldrich's isolation and confinement were made possible by her husband's position and the deference that people show to authority figures. An astute observation. The senator's political status provided him with credibility and access that a private citizen would not have possessed. It also made investigators reluctant to pursue theories that might implicate such a prominent figure. Do you think justice was served? Partially. Mrs. Aldrich is safe and will recover from her ordeal. Senator Aldrich will face appropriate consequences for his crimes. Dr. Hartwell's reputation is vindicated, even though his actual killer may never be identified. And Kellerman? Dr. Kellerman will have to live with the consequences of his own choices, both professional and personal. His affair with a patient violated ethical standards that exist for good reasons, and those violations contributed to the tragic chain of events that followed. That evening, as I sat in my room reflecting on the case and its resolution, I found myself thinking about the various forms of deception we had encountered and the ways in which truth had ultimately prevailed despite elaborate efforts to conceal. Senator Aldrich's scheme had been remarkably comprehensive, involving medical fraud, psychological manipulation, political influence, and ultimately murder. Yet it had been undone by the persistent observations of a concerned psychiatrist and the courage of a woman who refused to accept that her symptoms were evidence of mental illness. The case had also illustrated the importance of skepticism in the face of apparent certainty. The police had been convinced of Kellerman's guilt based on compelling evidence of motive and opportunity. Yet that evidence had been carefully constructed to serve the purposes of the actual perpetrator, demonstrating how truth and falsehood could be artfully woven together to create convincing but ultimately deceptive narratives. Most importantly, the case had shown how the abuse of institutional authority could be used to silence victims and prevent the exposure of criminal activity. Mrs. Aldrich's confinement and medical treatment had been justified by her husband's political position and apparent concern for her welfare. Without the intervention of independent professionals willing to challenge those justifications, she would likely have disappeared into a private psychiatric facility where her eventual death would have been attributed to natural causes or suicide. The following week brought a final chapter to the case when Inspector Kramer called with news about Dr. Hartwell's actual killer. "We got him," he said with evident satisfaction. "Professional hitman named Vincent Torino. Works for a private security firm that specializes in corporate espionage and problem elimination. The senator hired him through intermediaries to make Hartwell's death look like suicide." "How did you identify him?" "Financial records, mostly. The senator made several large payments to consulting firms that turned out to be fronts for Torino's operation. When we showed Torino the evidence and explained that he was facing murder charges, he decided cooperation was preferable to a life sentence." "What was his method?" "Drugged Hartwell with something that rendered him unconscious, then forced the barbiturates and alcohol down his throat. Made it look like suicide, while ensuring that Hartwell couldn't fight back or call for help." "And the typed suicide note, forged." "Torino had samples of Hartwell's writing and access to his personal stationery. The signature was traced from documents in Hartwell's office. Professional job. Very professional. If it hadn't been for the poisoning investigation, we probably never would have looked beyond the obvious suicide explanation." The news brought a sense of closure to the case, but it also reinforced the unsettling reality of how easily an innocent person's death could be disguised as something else entirely. Dr. Hartwell had died because he had the professional expertise and moral courage to recognize that his patient was being systematically poisoned. His reward for that insight had been a carefully orchestrated murder designed to eliminate him. While discrediting his theories about Mrs. Aldrich's condition. 2 months later, I received a letter from Mrs. Aldrich, written from a private clinic in Switzerland, where she was completing her recovery. The handwriting was clear and precise, showing none of the confusion and disorientation that had characterized her earlier communications. Dear Mr. Goodwin and Mr. Wolfe, I wanted to write to thank you both for your work on my behalf and to provide an update on my recovery and the legal proceedings against my husband. I am pleased to report that my health has improved dramatically since the unauthorized medications were eliminated from my system. The memory problems, anxiety episodes, and cognitive confusion have all resolved completely, confirming Dr. Mitchell's assessment that my symptoms were artificially induced rather than naturally occurring. The trial has been scheduled for next spring, and prosecutors are confident that the evidence against James will result in a conviction on all charges. His defense team has attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, but I have insisted that the case go to trial so that the full extent of his crimes becomes part of the public record. I have also learned more about Philip's investigation into my condition and his attempts to gather evidence that would protect me from further harm. His notes, which were found in a safe deposit box he had rented under an assumed name, contained detailed observations about my symptoms and their correlation with specific events and locations. He had also begun testing samples of food and beverages from our home, and several of these samples showed evidence of the same substances that were found in my medications. Philip died trying to save my life, and I want to ensure that his sacrifice is remembered and honored. I'm establishing a foundation in his name that will provide support for victims of domestic abuse and psychiatric manipulation, particularly those cases involving the misuse of medical authority. As for Marcus, we have spoken several times since my recovery began, and we have both agreed that our relationship developed under circumstances that make it difficult to determine our genuine feelings for each other. He is receiving counseling to address the ethical violations involved in our affair, and I am focusing on my own healing and recovery. Perhaps in time, we will be able to develop a healthier friendship. But for now, we both need space to understand ourselves and our motivations. I hope you will accept the enclosed check as compensation for your services and as a small token of my gratitude for your willingness to believe me when others assumed I was simply a mentally ill woman making irrational accusations. Your investigation not only saved my life, but also ensured that justice would be served for Philip's murder. With profound gratitude, Margaret Aldrich. The check was for considerably more than our standard fee, but Wolfe accepted it without comment. I suspected he understood, as I did, that the money represented more than payment for services rendered. It was Mrs. Aldrich's way of acknowledging the value of being believed and protected when she was most vulnerable. The case had provided several valuable lessons about the nature of deception and the importance of looking beyond obvious explanations. It had also demonstrated how institutional authority could be misused to conceal criminal activity and silence victims who might otherwise seek help. But perhaps most importantly, it had shown how truth could prevail even in the face of sophisticated attempts to conceal it, provided that people with the proper skills and moral courage were willing to persist in their search for facts rather than accepting convenient fictions. The final resolution came 6 months later, when Senator Aldrich was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His political career was destroyed, his reputation ruined, and his elaborate scheme to murder his wife exposed for the calculated and cruel conspiracy it had been. Vincent Torino, the professional killer who had murdered Dr. Hartwell, received a life sentence as well, though his cooperation with the investigation earned him the possibility of parole after 25 years. The private security firm that had facilitated the killing was disbanded, and several of its principals faced federal charges related to conspiracy and racketeering. Dr. Kellerman eventually resumed his psychiatric practice, though he never again treated patients with whom he had personal relationships. His experience with the case had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and the dangers inherent in becoming emotionally involved with people who depended on his clinical judgment. Mrs. Aldrich recovered completely from her ordeal and became a prominent advocate for victims of domestic abuse and psychiatric manipulation. The foundation she established in Philip Hartwell's name funded research into the medical aspects of spousal abuse and provided resources for healthcare professionals who suspected their patients might be victims of systematic poisoning or other forms of medical abuse. As I write this account several years after the case concluded, I find myself thinking about the various forms of deception we encountered and the ways in which truth ultimately prevailed, despite elaborate efforts to conceal it. Senator Aldrich's scheme had been comprehensive and sophisticated, involving multiple layers of misdirection and the careful manipulation of institutional authorities who might otherwise have questioned his actions. Yet, the scheme had been undone by a combination of professional expertise, moral courage, and stubborn persistence in the face of apparent certainty. Dr. Hartwell had recognized that his patient's symptoms didn't match the patterns he would expect from natural mental illness. Dr. Mitchell had been willing to challenge the assumptions of other medical professionals about Mrs. Aldrich's condition. Mrs. Aldrich herself had found the strength to risk everything in order to discover the truth about what was happening to her. The case had also illustrated the importance of skepticism when confronted with explanations that seemed almost too convenient to be true. Kellerman's affair had provided a perfect motive for murder, complete with compelling evidence of means and opportunity, yet that very perfection had been part of an elaborate deception designed to divert attention from the real crimes being committed. In the end, justice had been served, though not without cost. Dr. Hartwell had paid with his life for his willingness to investigate activities that powerful people wanted to keep secret. Mrs. Aldrich had endured months of systematic poisoning and psychological abuse before finding the courage and resources to fight back. Even Kellerman, despite his own ethical failures, had suffered imprisonment and professional disgrace while serving as a scapegoat for crimes he hadn't committed. But truth had prevailed, and that truth had prevented further harm to innocent people, while ensuring that those responsible for serious crimes faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Even now, years later, I still find myself wondering about certain aspects of the case. Was justice truly served, or merely satisfied? Could we have acted more quickly to prevent Dr. Hartwell's death if we had been more skeptical of the obvious explanations? Would Mrs. Aldrich have survived if she hadn't found the courage to risk everything in order to discover the truth about her condition? And I wonder about you, dear reader, as you consider this account of deception, courage, and the ultimate triumph of truth over elaborate lies. What would you have done in Mrs. Aldrich's position, faced with the growing realization that someone you trusted was systematically destroying your mind and preparing to end your life? Would you have found the strength to fight back, or would you have accepted the convenient explanations offered by those who claim to care about your welfare? Tell me, from whatever corner of the world you're reading this, what city lights are reflecting in your windows tonight as you ponder these questions? Are you in New York, watching the same rain-slicked streets that witnessed this drama unfold? Or perhaps London, where the fog creates the same kind of atmospheric uncertainty that can conceal both truth and deception? Maybe you're in some smaller place where the stakes seem lower, but the human capacity for both cruelty and courage remains just as profound. In the end, I've come to believe that the answers we find are rarely as important as the questions they compel us to ask. The truth about Dr. Hartwell's death mattered because it revealed larger truths about the abuse of power, the vulnerability of those who depend on others for care, and the courage required to challenge authority when that authority is being used to conceal criminal activity. But the most important truth may be the simplest one, that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can find within themselves the resources necessary to stand up for what is right, even when doing so requires them to risk everything they hold dear. That truth, I think, is worth remembering long after. The specific details of this case have faded from memory,